All right, I promised you a new read aloud, so here it is. This is the book that if we were in class, we would be reading right now. And so it is truly one of my favorite books, and so decided that we were going to read it regardless. So I will post it as individual chapters. Some chapters are really short, but that way you can kind of, if you want to listen to multiple chapters, you can. So I will just label them on the YouTube channel. Woohoo! Still weird to say that I have a YouTube channel. This is Sign of the Beaver. Matt stood at the edge of the clearing for some time after his father had gone out of sight among the trees. There was just a chance that his father might turn back, that perhaps he had forgotten something or had some last word of advice. This was one time Matt reckoned he wouldn't mind the advice, no matter how many times he had heard it before. But finally he had to admit that this was not going to happen. His father had really gone. He was alone, with miles of wilderness stretching on every side. He turned and looked back at the log house. It was a fair house, he thought. His mother would have no cause to be ashamed of it. He had helped to build every inch of it. He had helped to cut down the spruce trees and haul the logs and square and notch them. He had stood at one end of every log and raised it one on top of the other, fitting the notched ends together as snugly as though they had grown that way. He had climbed the roof to fasten down the cedar splints with long poles and dragged up pine boughs to cover them. Behind the cabin were mounds of corn that he had helped to plant, the green blades already shooting up, and the pumpkin vines just showing between the stumps of the trees. If it only were not so quiet. He had been alone before. His father had gone into the forest to hunt for hours on end. Even when he was there, he was not much of a talker. Sometimes they had worked side by side through a whole morning without his speaking a single word. But this silence was different. It coiled around Matt and reached into his stomach to settle there in a hard knot. He knew it was high time his father was starting back. This was part of the plan that the family had worked out together in the long winter of 1768, sitting by a lamplight around the pine table back in Massachusetts. His father had spread out the surveyor's map and traced the boundaries of the land he had purchased in Maine territory. They would be the first settlers in a new township. In the spring, when the ice melted, Matt and his father would travel north. They would take passage on a ship to the settlement on the mouth of the Penobscot River. Then they would find some man with a boat to take them up the river and then on a smaller river that branched off from it, many days' distance from the settlement. Finally, they would strike out on foot into the forest and claim their own plot of land. They would clear a patch of ground, build a cabin, and plant some corn. In the summer, his father would go back to Massachusetts to fetch his mother and sister and the new baby, who would be born while they were gone. Matt would stay behind and guard the cabin and the corn patch. It hadn't been quite so easy as it had sounded back in their house in Quincy. Matt had had to get used to going to sleep at night with every muscle in his body aching. But the log house was finished. It had only one room. Before winter, they would add a loft for him and his sister to sleep in. Inside, there were shelves along one wall and a sturdy punch table with 2 stools. One of these days, his father promised, he would cut out a window and fasten oiled paper to let the light in. Some day the paper would be replaced with real glass. Against the wall was a chimney of smaller logs daubed and lined with clay from the creek. This, too, was a temporary structure. Over and over, his father had warned Matt that it wasn't as safe as a stone chimney and that he had to watch out for flying sparks. He needn't fear. After all, the work of building this house, Matt wasn't going to let it burn down about his ears. 6 weeks, his father had said that morning. Maybe 7, hard to reckon exactly. With your ma and sister, we'll be having slow going, especially with the new little one. You may lose track of weeks, he had added. Easy thing to do when you're alone. Might be well to make notches on a stick. 7 notches to a stick. When you get to the 7th stick, you can start looking for us. A silly thing to do, Matt thought, as though he couldn't count the weeks for himself. But he wouldn't argue about it. Not on this morning. Then his father reached up to a chink in the log wall and took down the battered tin box that held his watch and his compass and a few silver coins. He took out the big silver watch. Every time you cut a notch, he said, remember to wind this up at the same time. Matt took the watch in his hand, and as gently as if it were a bird's egg. "You aim to leave it, Pa?" he asked. "It belonged to your grandpa. Would have belonged to you somehow, sooner or later. Might as well be now." "You mean it's mine?" "Aye, it's yourn. Be kind of company hearing it tick." The lump in Matt's throat felt as big as the watch. This was the finest thing that his father had ever possessed. "I'll take care of it," he managed finally. "Aye, I knowed you would. Mind you don't wind it up too tight." Then, just before he left, his father had given him a second gift. Thinking of it, Matt walked back into the cabin and looked up at his father's rifle hanging on 2 pegs over the door. "I'll take your own blunderbuss with me," his father had said. "This one aims truer. But mind you, don't go banging away at everything that moves. Wait till you're dead sure. There's plenty of powder if you don't waste it." It was the first sign he had given that he felt uneasy about leaving Matt here alone. Matt wished now that he could have said something to reassure his father instead of just standing there tongue-tied. But if he had the chance again, he knew he wouldn't do any better. They just weren't a family to put things into words. He reached up and took down the rifle. It was lighter than his old matchlock, the one his father had carried away with him in exchange. This was a fine piece, the walnut stock as smooth and shining as his mother's silk dress. It was a mite long, but it had a good balance. With this gun, he wouldn't need to waste powder, so it wouldn't hurt to take one shot right now, just to try the feel of it. He knew his father always kept that rifle as clean as a new polished spoon, but because he enjoyed handling it, Matt poked about in the touch hole with the metal pick. From the powder horn, he shook a little of the black powder into the pan. Then he took one lead bullet out of the pouch, wrapped it in a patch of cloth, and rammed it into the barrel. As he worked, he whistled loudly into the stillness. It made the knot in his stomach loosen a little. As he stepped into the woods, a blue jay screeched a warning. So it was some time before he spotted anything to shoot at. Presently, he saw a red squirrel hunched on a branch with its tail curled up behind its ears. He lifted the rifle and sighted along the barrel, minding his father's advice, and waited until he was dead sure. The clean feel of the shot delighted him. It didn't set him back on his heels like his old gun. Still, he hadn't quite got the knack of it. He caught the flick of a tail as the squirrel scampered to an upper branch. "I could do better with my own gun," he thought. This rifle of his father's was going to take some getting used to. Ruefully, he trudged back to the cabin. For his noon meal, he sat munching a bit of the johnny cake his father had baked that morning. Already, he was beginning to realize that time was going to move slowly. A whole afternoon to go before he could cut that very first notch. 7 sticks. That would be August. He would have a birthday before August. He supposed his father had forgotten that with so many things on his mind. By the time his family got here, he would be 13 years old. So, think about when this story is taking place. It's obviously not future. They're building a log cabin out in the woods. They're hunting for their food. He is only 12 years old, and his father's just left him for 6 to 7 weeks to go get his ma and his sister and the new baby that will be born. So, chapter 1,